Okay. Uh, Thank you everyone for joining us. Good afternoon and welcome to the latest installment of the U.S. Asia Institute's webinar entitled today State of Democracy: Implications of Recent Snap Elections in Japan and Korea. My name is Kendall Higgins and I am a program assistant at the U.S. Asia Institute. For those who have attended our events in the past, welcome back. And for those who are new to the U.S. Asia Institute, thank you for joining us. USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with 47-year track record of building understanding and strengthening ties between the peoples and governments of the United States and Asia. Today's webinar is part of our Northeast Asia in Focus webinar series. Northeast Asia in Focus offers unique insights into U.S. partnerships with Northeast Asian nations through speakers with firsthand knowledge of global power competition in the region. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize our corporate stakeholders: FedEx, Coupang, Suntory, AIG, Akin, Fairfield Maxwell, PMI, Google, Organon, and the Korea Foundation for helping to make programs like this one possible. I'd now like to introduce our moderator, Mr. Ben Wu. Mr. Wu is the Vice Chairman of the U.S. Asia Institute. Previously, he served as the Deputy Undersecretary of Commerce for Technology and the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Technology Policy for President George W. Bush's administration. He also worked in Congress as a senior staffer on the House Science Committee, as well as served as the Deputy Secretary and Chief Operating Officer of the Maryland Department of Commerce. Finally, Mr. Wu was also the former president and CEO of the Montgomery County Economic Development Corporation, leading the economic recovery during the COVID-19 pandemic in Maryland's largest jurisdiction. We are very grateful to have Mr. Wu participating in today's discussion. So just before I introduce it, or hand it over to him now, I just want to let everyone know that please stick around for the entire webinar and feel free to leave any questions you have for the speakers in the chat box function, and we will be sure to get to them at the end of the webinar. So thank you so much, and without further ado, I will pass it over to Mr. Wu to say a few words and introduce our panelists.
Hey, thank you, Kendall, for the kind introduction. As a vice chair of the U.S. Asia Institute, hello, everyone, and welcome to our ongoing informational series on critical subjects that impact the Asia-Pacific region. We appreciate the time you're taking to join the seminar with us this afternoon. These conversations are devoted to help our friends in Congress, think tanks, the business community, academia, and among the diplomatic corps to better understand the timely and important issues affecting the United States and Asia. And today we're focusing, as Kendall mentioned, on East Asia, specifically Japan and Korea, and the recent snap elections in Japan and the early presidential election in South Korea that are really redefining both nations' electoral politics and have really empowered their new leadership. So what does this mean for United States bilateral and trilateral efforts? We'll explore those questions and also discuss how these two nations, Japan and South Korea, can balance domestic priorities with foreign policy interests within an environment of diplomatic tension and competition in the Asia-Pacific region. And to help lead the discussion, we're privileged to have two policy experts join us, Yuko Nakano and Darcie Draudt-Véjares. Ms. Yuko Nakano is an associate director of the U.S.-Japan Strategic Leadership Program and a fellow of the Japan Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Her research focuses on U.S.-Japan relations and also legislative affairs with the Strategic Leadership Program at CSIS, which brings together outside experts with Japanese Diet members for closed strategic discussions on current issues affecting the U.S.-Japan alliance. And prior to joining CSIS in 2004, Ms. Nakano was an adjunct associate producer with NHK Japan Broadcasting Corporation's Washington, D.C. Bureau. She holds a BA in law from Keio University in Tokyo, Japan, and an MA in international relations and international economics with a concentration in strategic studies from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Joining Yuko will be Dr. Darcie Draudt-Véjares. Dr. Draudt-Véjares is a fellow for Korean Studies in the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and her research focuses on domestic politics and foreign policy of the Korean Peninsula, as well as U.S.-Korea relations. Dr. Draudt-Véjares has held postdoctoral positions at the Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs and the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. She holds a PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins University, an MA in Korean Studies from the Yonsei University, and an AB with honors from Davidson College. So with that, let me turn it over to our two esteemed panelists. And Yuko, why don't we go ahead and start with you, and then we'll go with Darcie.
So thank you for having us today. I will begin with Japan's recent election and then turn to Prime Minister Takaichi's policy priorities and what they may mean going forward. So on February 8th, Japanese voters went to the polls for the House of Representatives, the lower chamber of Japan's national parliament called the Diet. The Diet is bicameral. It has the House of Representatives, often called the lower house, and the House of Councillors, the upper house. The lower house is generally considered more powerful as it has an overriding authority under certain conditions in cases where the two chambers disagree. And the result of the snap election was a landslide victory for Prime Minister Takaichi and her Liberal Democratic Party. The LDP secured 316 seats out of 455, the largest number won by a single party in the post-World War II era. And compared to the pre-election standing, the party gained 188 seats. So you may have seen headlines saying that the Takaichi's gamble paid off. So to understand the significance of this major election win, I think it is worth unpacking why it was a gamble in the first place. So when she became the party leader in last October, she inherited a minority government from a predecessor, Shigeru Ishiba. The LDP had suffered setbacks in two separate national elections. And first, in a snap election of the lower house in October 2024, and then in the upper house election in July 2025. And those losses reflected several factors. First and foremost, the voters were frustrated that the ruling coalition had not adequately addressed inflation, particularly for staples such as rice. And then there was this funding scandals that continued to hurt the party's credibility. And additionally, the parts of the conservative base were uneasy with what they saw as a more socially liberal direction. And that combination led some LDP voters to look elsewhere. And smaller, the newer parties gained traction. And Takaichi faced uncertainty from the onset. The Komeito, the LDP's long-standing coalition partner for nearly a decade, 25 years, chose to part ways when she became the LDP president. And without Komeito's backing, her path to securing enough votes in the Diet to become prime minister was in question. So in the following days, the LDP managed to form a new partnership with the Japan Innovation Party, which is a smaller Osaka-based party. Then she was finally appointed prime minister. So against this backdrop, dissolving the lower house only 4 months into office carried a real political risk. So she was essentially seeking a fresh mandate before voters had seen the impact of her policies. So her approval ratings were very strong in the 60s and 70% range. The risk was that the support for the LDP itself remained in the high 20s and 30s. So when news broke in early January that she was considering an early election, pundits were unsure if her personal popularity would translate into a win for the party. So in every major opinion poll conducting leading up to the election, counter-inflation measures were the top voter concerns, followed by social security, economy and employment, and then finally the foreign and security policies. And in-depth analysis will be done in due course, but the initial data gives us a few interesting signals about voter behavior. First, the LDP led in every age category. And what stands out is that the younger voters and what we might call the working generation, those in their 20s through 50s, move back towards LDP. For example, among the youngest eligible voters and those aged 18 and 19 years old, 38% voted for the LDP, and that is roughly a 15-point increase compared to the 2024 lower house election. And the LDP, or Prime Minister Takaichi, has also made inroads with independents. And so the scale of her victory has shifted the political landscape and in how policy will move through the diet. So from a parliamentary procedural standpoint, the election outcome is consequential in two ways. First, the LDP secured enough seats to reclaim control of committee chairmanships and majorities in each committee. So since 2024, the LDP had been forced to share committee assignments with opposition parties, including the very influential budget committee. And that constraint is now gone. Second, with 316 seats, the LDP surpasses the two-thirds threshold in the lower house. And under Japan's constitution, that enables the lower house to override the upper house. So while the LDP remains in the minority in the upper house, this significantly strengthened the Prime Minister's legislative leverage. And Prime Minister and other LDP leaderships have signaled so far their intention to work across party lines. So I do not expect routine use of this overriding authority. However, having that option influence bargaining dynamics and is the path for government's legislative agenda. So that brings us to the question of Prime Minister Takaichi's policy priorities. So her immediate task is to pass the fiscal year 2026 budget. Japan's fiscal year begins in April, and the January dissolution of the Diet disrupted that legislative timetable. So opposition parties questioned the timing of the election and criticized her for sidelining economic concerns. So it is imperative for the Prime Minister to demonstrate that she's focused on tackling inflation and easing the burden on families who are feeling the squeeze. And beyond economic management, a consistent theme that runs through her speeches is to strengthen Japan's capability to respond to crises and security challenges, ranging from natural disasters to more traditional security threats. And what stands out is at how closely she links economic policy and security policy. She emphasizes the importance of strategic investment in advanced technologies, resilient supply chains, and critical infrastructure, for instance. And it is all framed not only as economic growth policy, but as an integral part of national security strategy. And for example, she has announced that Japan will reach defense spending of 2% of GDP 2 years ahead of schedule. And in addition, the LDP is reviewing the guidelines on defense equipment and technology transfers to expand Japan's international defense cooperation, which will in turn strengthen Japan's own industrial and technological base. And another major undertaking will be revising the so-called three strategic documents, the core policy framework that defines Japan's strategic objectives and guides defense planning. And the LDP is expected to submit its recommendations on the revisions of the three strategic documents in the spring, and which will feed into the government's annual blueprint for its economic and fiscal policies. So usually released in early summer. And then the cabinet is expected to approve the new three strategic document by the end of the year. So the defense planning, physical priorities, and growth strategies are moving on the same track rather than in separate lanes. So the sequencing or the timetable underscores how defense and security policies are embedded in Japan's broader strategy. And so the securing a strong public mandate and regaining the lower house majority does not necessarily mean that the Takaichi administration can move forward on every part of its agenda without resistance. So one area to watch is intelligence reform. The LDP has been working to strengthen Japan's intelligence capabilities, including tighter institutional coordination and stronger penalties for unauthorized disclosure and the passage of security clearance legislation. And as a next step, the government plans to submit a legislation in the coming month to establish a new national intelligence agency, effectively and upgrading the current Cabinet Intelligence and Research Office, or CSIRO, to improve coordination across ministries. And there appears to be fairly the broad agreement that Japan needs to strengthen intelligence collection and analysis. In that sense, the institutional upgrade itself may not generate intense pushback, but the more sensitive issue is counter-espionage legislation. So unlike the 2014 state secrecy law, which targeted internal leaks, the current debate is about addressing external actors who attempts to obtain sensitive information. And this is an area where we see a gap in the current legal framework. And the Prime Minister Takaichi has described such legislation as pressing and arguing that Japan needs a stronger legal tools to prevent sensitive information from falling in the hands of foreign actors. And the Japan Innovation Party, the LDP's new coalition partner, has expressed their support for enacting such law. And some opposition parties also have put forward their own anti-spying proposal. However, the main opposition party, the Centrist Reform Alliance, along with some legal scholars and media outlets, have raised concerns about privacy and civil liberties and government transparency. And there is a historical context for this sensitivity because back in 2014, then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe succeeded in passing the aforementioned the state secrecy law, and after very intense debate in the Diet and a strong criticism in the media. So even with the 2/3 majority in the lower house, and this is an area where the administration will need to proceed carefully. And so for partners like the United States, and this reflects in Japan's effort to strengthen its security toolkit, and the way this debate unfolds will shape how far and fast these reforms move. So the examples that I have shared may seem domestic focused, but they have real implications for how Japan coordinates with the United States and other partners, and carry broader implications for Japan's strategic posture in the Indo-Pacific. I was planning to say a few words about the upcoming US-Japan summit, but I realized I am running over time, so perhaps we can come back to that in the discussion. So I end here.
Great. Thank you, Yuko. Thank you for giving us a rundown of Prime Minister Takahachi's gamble to call for snap elections. She won big, so that will put her in good stead, especially as we look forward to the next couple of weeks. On March 19th, the Prime Minister will be coming to visit President Trump at the White House for a very important bilateral visit. And so we can talk a little bit more about that when we get into the questions and answer period. Now let me turn it over to Darcie to give her presentation and to share with a little bit about us with her areas of expertise.
Great, thank you all. And I'm glad for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts and research that I've been doing. I thought what I'd do is to try to keep under time is I'll tell you a little bit about how Korea got where it was with electing a president early this last year, and then talk a little bit about how the current president is managing its foreign relations with key neighbors, namely US, China, and Japan and North Korea. What's really, I mean, compared to Japan recently elected its new prime minister and had recent snap elections. Korea's is a little bit earlier. That happened in late May of 2025. But what's really important is how exceptional the context was that led up to that particular election. Korean elections weren't scheduled for another couple of years, a presidential election. Korea has one-term, 5-year presidencies, term limits. And the previous president who had been impeached was only in office for about 2 years. So it's been pretty well covered by the news. So I'm sure it's no surprise to anyone in this room, the circumstances, but just to set this up and to kind of sketch out some of the domestic context that led it to that way is in December 2024, the previous president, who has since been impeached, Yoon Suk-yeol, declared martial law in his country, which was really quite a shock to everybody in the nation because the country was safe. It was abiding by democratic procedures. What we know now is he was frustrated with the deadlock that had happened in the National Assembly, and he saw martial law and dispatching troops to the National Assembly as a way to cut through what he saw as deadlock. He was the Korean presidency is very powerful. In fact, so much so that people like Korean politics insiders call it the imperial presidency because the executive branch is so strong relative to the legislative branch. But in this case, the opposition party had control of the National Assembly. He was very frustrated with that. What's quite amazing, and I can talk. I'm happy to talk about this more in the context of what this means for Korean democracy, is the response that happened so quickly. The President Yoon had dispatched troops to enter the National Assembly in the evening around like 8 p.m. And within the 3 hours, the martial law declaration was over, and not probably because of the immense response from Korean citizens, not necessarily just the opposition party, but Korean citizens mobilized and blocked entry to the National Assembly. This is really important because it shows just how vibrant Koreans are and responsive they are to what they saw as an immediate threat to the democracy that has happened. So after that, President Yoon was impeached within a few weeks, and that was upheld in the Korean Constitutional Court of April of last year, which meant that an election was going to be held in a couple months later, in late May 2025. The election was Korea is a very polarized country, very deeply polarized. It has been historically, and it's gotten even more so in the past decade or so. Deep social cleavages, differences of ideology. I would say it's actually less about ideology in a sense compared to other countries. As a political scientist, both Korean parties are relatively centrist politically. A lot of this is very identity based. And when I say identity, I mean party identity, because Korea is a very ethnically, culturally homogenous country. But this idea of Korean conservatives and Korean progressives is a really deep-seated part for many Korean citizens. And so what we saw in the election was it was very, very bitter. There was a lot of infighting in the Conservative Party that continues to this day about how do we grapple with what President Yoon did and what should we do about our party going forward. This has plagued Korean politics for the past year or so since then, or I mean, it's a year and a few months since the impeachment. And so that's a really important feature of domestic polarization today. The progressives, on the other hand, and this is also very important when we think about foreign policy, have undergone quite a remarkable shift in how they're talking about their ideology, their platform. And that led to this election of this Lee Jae-myung, who is now the president. He presented himself as the word that was always used was pragmatist. He and his campaign self-styled him as a pragmatist rather than an ideologue. Now, what does that mean in the Korean context? Historically, progressives in South Korea were identified by their relationship with the democratization movement in the 1980s and their preference for a more engagement strategy toward North Korea. That was the core of Korean Progressive Party until recently. Now, I've argued and I've written some things about this. It's actually been quite a bigger shift that's happening from the bottom up. Social changes that are going on, generational changes where younger Koreans aren't necessarily as interested in engaging with North Korea because they see them as, an enemy state. They see them as aggressive. They see them as nuclear weapons, like the nuclear program, as a threat to them. So I think this is actually a much longer change that's been going on, but it's really important in the context of the election because Lee Jae-myung presented himself as not part of that North Korea-focused ideological group that's characterized and dominated the Korean progressive politics. Instead, he was a pragmatist. He talked about he was a centrist. He also, from a policy wonk perspective, he's a domestic politics guy. He's not a foreign policy guy. So he's much more interested, and this is how his campaign or his administration has been run, is largely focused on economic issues, helping promote social welfare across the country, helping with basic cost of living concerns, which the world is undergoing as well. This isn't exceptional to Korea in that sense, but it's really been not necessarily centering North Korea that has been the flagship policy of his progressive predecessors. So that's really important too. So the shift now to talking about how he's conducted his foreign policy, the name of the game for him has again been pragmatism. Number one is he's been focused on making sure the economy of his country is on track at a moment where the global economy over the past year has been quite disrupted. And so he's prioritized working with the United States and ensuring, in the course of tariff negotiations that they would get the most favorable deal. He did that by working with large corporations in Korea in order to pledge $450 billion of investments, $150 billion of which is specifically for President Trump's MASGA, Make American Shipbuilding Great Again initiative, which we're already seeing some returns on. Some of these predated Trump too, actually, with the purchase of the Hanwha Philly shipyard by a Korean company. But these are things that are really ongoing, that are have been proceeding under this progressive politician that historically we wouldn't have expected to be so forward-leaning on working with the Americans. So economics and ensuring positive economic relations with the United States and protecting, especially in high-tech sectors, semiconductors, batteries for both EV and electronic storage systems. This has been a really important part of his foreign policy with the United States. The other thing that's really important to note is how it still is a question mark of how he's going to be dealing with China. To date, it's been much less, what's the word I want to use? there was a lot of debate over whether he'd be much more China friendly, and whether that would mean a pivot away from the United States over the past year. But I don't think we've seen that. He's been really prioritizing relations with the United States, Japan, and other like-minded partners. Now, the China component is a bit complicated because the China matters so much for Korean economy still. It is very true, and if you look at different sectoral analyses, that in many cases, Korean companies are trying to either friendshore, reshore, or decrease their vulnerability to Chinese markets. Over the past decade, there's been a lot of concerns in South Korea in the private sector and among citizens more broadly about the attention that China plays on the regulations and restrictions that it has on Korean investments in China. So this has been part of a larger shift away from thinking, oh, let's pivot away from our heavy footprint in China and our economic vulnerability. And I think that logic is at the center of China, of Lee Jae-myung's strategy toward dealing with China. There's a lot to unpack there, but I think I'll leave it there for now. The other thing that's important when we think about Korea, any president administration's Korea's relations with China, is how China affects its relations with North Korea. So as I mentioned, this particular president does have a North Korea strategy. It's focused on they call it a stepwise approach to denuclearization and friendly relations. But the context now in 2026 is extremely different from the context in 2018, 2019, when President Trump and then President Moon, also a progressive South Korean president, had met with Kim Jong-un, which was unprecedented, the first time. The context now is completely different. North Korea has declared South Korea a hostile state. North Korea has sent troops and munitions to Russia to help with its war in Ukraine. And from what we know, Russia is also likewise sending some technical assistance to help North Korea develop its different aspects of its technological development, which it's always necessary. It's always slightly behind the global curve on that now. So now the reason why I mention this is now it's not China that's necessarily at the center of Korea's calculations about dealing with North Korea, but Russia has reemerged as an important player of how South Korea is thinking of its relations with Russia, or North Korea, I mean. And so it's a little bit on the back burner, I think, for now, for a variety of reasons. And then to wrap up, I'll also point to the important changes in how Lee Jae-myung has reached or sought to work with Japan. Again, a big part of the Korean the historical progressives in Korea have been much more wary to work with Japan because of various issues related to history, mostly related to how Japan's empire colonized Korea in the early part of the 20th century, and then was liberated after World War II. So there's major issues, including territorial disputes over an island that's situated between the two countries. Historical memory about in how both countries are talking about in school textbooks. This is the other major one. And then the third one is debates over the issue of sexual slavery or comfort women, how the Japan Empire incorporated women into a system of sexual slavery throughout the empire. So these three things have been historically extremely important for the progressives in South Korea as an important barriers to productive relations between Korea and Japan. But what's different is, again, Lee Jae-myung is a domestic politics guy. He's not a foreign politics guy. He's made the unprecedented step of working much more closely with Japan. And it seems that he's not getting the fallout that his predecessors might have done. We saw this most importantly in his first summit was not with the United States, and it was not with China, which is what we usually expect. It was actually with Japan. And I think there's a few different calculated reasons, because Korea and Japan are both vulnerable to the same economic and security changes that are going on in the region, that he wanted to show that there was a partnership that was worth being developed. And I think it's not just these kind of high-level strategic considerations, but what's really interesting here, and things that have been going on at the kind of from the bottom up level, especially in the private sector, is cooperation on emerging economic and energy challenges. Things like, how do we deal with AI? How do we deal with automation and robotics? How do we deal with the energy transition? Because both countries are really depend on foreign sources of energy. And so we're seeing a slight more alignment in Korea and Japan, even among Korean progressives. And we saw this again. So that his first visit was with Takaichi's predecessor, Shigeru Ishiba, but he met again with the new prime minister, and they had this amazing. I mean, it was quite a lively summit where both of them. It's Prime Minister Takaichi is a known drummer, and they had Lee Jae-myung on a drum kit of his own, and they were rocking out together, and it was really quite a remarkable sight to see as somebody who's watched this for almost 20 years, to see a Korean progressive have this jovial time with a Japanese conservative on the stage and the world stage was really, I think, a remarkable shift in how the two countries are portraying their relations. So I'm coming up on time, so I'll stop there. But I think I put a lot on the table for us to talk about.
Well, thank you, Darcie. And we'd love to see beautiful music being played in the Asia Pacific region. Thank you also, Yuko and Darcie, for really thoughtful, informative, and comprehensive presentations that allow us to tee up some of the discussion that we're going to have now. I want to urge anybody who has a question to put it into the chat, but I want to open it up with two sets of questions, one from a bilateral relationship and then the other from a trilateral view. Yuko, I had mentioned that the Prime Minister Takahashi is going to be coming to see President Trump on March 19th. And President Trump is one who really values personal relationships between himself and other world leaders. And I wanted to see if you could help us get a sense of what might be discussed, because President Trump is extending this invitation to quote unquote carve out a new chapter in the Japan-U.S. alliance. And it's not lost also on Asia watchers that in a few weeks afterwards, subsequent to Prime Minister Takahashi's bilateral visit to the United States and the White House, President Trump is going to be heading over to Beijing for his meetings with President Xi. And there has been some tension in the Sino-Japan relationship that started out when Prime Minister Takahashi made a comment about Japan that led to ultimately boycotts on sushi in Beijing and Shanghai, among other things. And so within that context, if you could discuss what you might expect coming out of the upcoming visit to Washington by the Japanese Prime Minister. And then Darcie, President Trump and South Korean President Lee don't have meetings planned for this year currently, but they did have several meetings last year after the early presidential elections in June from their first summit when President Lee came to the White House and to Washington in August, and then also their second summit when President Trump visited South Korea for the APEC summit, and ahead of that went to Korea. I don't know if they were planning to meet in Shenzhen for the next APEC meeting coming up at the end of this year. But if you could also discuss that relationship between President Trump and South Korean President Lee. So Yuko, let me start off with you and talk a little bit about Prime Minister Takahashi's upcoming visit.
Okay, thank you for the questions. How you frame the Takaichi visit. So a few days prior to Japan's election, President Trump endorsed Prime Minister Takaichi in his social media posting and announced her visit to the White House for a meeting on March 19th. So that itself is a little bit unusual. And then so in advance of the visit, a couple of weeks ago, Secretary Rubio met with Japan's National Security Advisor. And the readout highlighted enhancing deterrence and response capabilities under U.S.-Japan alliance and expanding bilateral economic security cooperation and reinforcing supply chains. So they also like exchange views on regional affairs that we assume to include China and Taiwan. And it is also reasonable to expect that these issues will feature at the summit. And now on Iran and the developments in the Middle East will be on the table as well. And a few points to keep an eye on as the summit approaches. So first, how Takaichi balances a strengthened domestic mandate with alliance coordination. So a stronger political position at home may raise expectation in Washington, and that she has greater capacity to make commitments whether on defense spending, alliance initiatives, or the regional coordination. But at the same time, it will be important for both domestic audiences and in Washington that any proposals she brings to the table are framed as proactive Japanese initiatives rather than reactions to pressure. And that's the first point. And secondly, how economic security cooperation evolves. So for example, as part of the bilateral trade agreement reached last July, Japan has committed to invest up to $550 billion in the United States by January 2029. The first tranche of that investment is already taking shape, totaling $36 billion with projects in energy and industrial infrastructure. So again, I think it is important for the leaders to frame these investments as mutually beneficial, creating jobs and boosting industrial capacity in both economies. And lastly, I will also be watching how two leaders address China in the joint messaging. China will be an important backdrop, as Mr. Wu mentioned, to this meeting because, as the President Trump is scheduled to visit China next month. In Tokyo, there is this like a quiet sensitivity about the possibility of U.S.-China engagement taking unexpected turns. So I think the Prime Minister's priority will likely be to reinforce alliance alignment on the U.S. engagement in the Indo-Pacific and ensure that there are no strategic surprises.
Thank you, Yuko. Darcie?
Yeah, briefly, yeah, we don't know when the next summit between Trump and Lee will be, but they did meet relatively quickly after Lee's election. Their first meeting was, he was elected very late May and took office in June last year. In August, Lee came to Washington and met with Trump in the White House. And I think it was largely there was a lot of worry, especially in the lead up to that. There was the announcement of tariffs that seemed to potentially hit Korea particularly hard. Korea is really vulnerable to those sorts of changes because its economy so heavily depends on exports, even more so than Japan. I mean, Korea and Japan's situation when it came to dealing with the Trump tariffs in the early parts, last summer, are relatively similar in one level. But on the other hand, the economies are a little bit different. Korea, 40% of its economy depends on trade compared to Japan's 20%. So Korea was really in a vulnerable position when it was meeting with Trump. And this is also in the lead, on years of Korea trying to, as I mentioned earlier, friendshore a lot of its important industries like automotive, batteries, shipbuilding, chip manufacturing. It had been starting in the Biden administration, actually a little bit in the first Trump administration too, to reshore to the United States in countries like Texas, Indiana, Michigan, Kentucky, Georgia, been moving these facilities. So it felt a bit vulnerable as its supply chain had been spanning these countries. And there were some comments in the lead up to that first summit in August from Trump's Truth Social post that it might be a bit of a confrontational meeting between the two. But then if you actually look at the public portion of the meeting, it was actually quite congenial. Trump did most of the talking. I think that was probably by design. Lee was very complimentary to Trump's efforts to make the country great again. And he mentioned he was trying to do the same with South Korea and wanted to help with the United States. I think a lot of it was couched in terms of the US-South Korea alliance, which has really been expanding over the past 10 years to not just be a narrow security guarantee toward North Korea, but to encompass economic relations, broader defense agreements, broader diplomatic agreements. So I think that was a really important part of the framing, is understanding that the alliance was thickening in a sense. So I think the first summit was, I think the progressives felt like it went very, very well. Their second summit, their second meeting was on the sidelines of APEC, which Korea hosted this year in the fall. And it was a bit of a different context than one of the big things overshadowing it was on the heels of the Hyundai meta plant raid in South Carolina, where Korean workers that were helping to build a new meta plant as part of this friendshoring initiative had been rapidly deported as part of the broader ICE campaign in the United States, and that was really disruptive in Seoul. That was really seen as a step back in this attempt to broaden and thicken the relationship. I was speaking in Korea a few days after that happened, specifically on industrial relations, and you could tell that there was a lot of confusion and feeling of upset. But what happened at APEC, I think, was a little bit different. I think those conversations happened in the back room, but APEC worked as a way for Korea to do what you could call hosting diplomacy, right? The main point there was not necessarily to get, in the public view, to get certain concessions on these big things, but rather to showcase the country as being able to facilitate high-level meetings. So I think it's not coincidental that the high level summit was between facilitating Xi and Trump, not necessarily trying to center South Korea in that conversation or the conversation with Trump. And so I think in that sense it was a little bit of a different aim, but then it could also serve a friendlier relationship with Trump, because Trump was really trying, like the question was, are Trump and Xi going to be meeting on the sidelines of that meeting? So South Korea was trying to facilitate that rather than necessarily have a big fanfare of a bilateral of their own.
Well, Yuko and Darcie, let's touch on the trilateral relationship. The trilateral partnership between the United States, Japan, and South Korea has been described as a primary bulwark in the Indo-Pacific region. And given the fact that since it was originally agreed to a couple of years ago, now we're navigating leadership transitions and domestic political pressures in all three capitals. All of the new leaders have been in place less than a year. And so there are new personalities coming into play. Can you guys touch a little bit about the trilateral partnership and what you think is the potential and the opportunities, or whether or not that's something that is not going to be received as well as it had been in the past?
Well, so maybe I'll go first, if that's okay.
Sure, Yuko.
Okay, so the Prime Minister Takaichi has repeatedly referred to the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Framework, or the FOIP, as a central pillar of foreign policy. And the FOIP is a strategic concept articulated under the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in the mid-2010s. And so at its core, it emphasizes the rule of law, freedom of navigation and connectivity, and regional order that is open and inclusive. And then the concept is intentionally set broadly, like not defense specific. And so the FOIP has reinforced the Quad, for instance, providing a conceptual foundation for deeper coordination among the United States, Australia, India, and Japan. And in that sense, the Prime Minister is signaling a clear continuity in Japan's broader regional strategy. And importantly, the FOIP framework has also gained bipartisan support in Washington, first adopted by the Trump administration, and then carried forward by President Biden. And then a critical element of FOIP is the deepening cooperation with regional partners such as South Korea, giving the shared strategic interest and the security challenges in Northeast Asia. And although US ROK Japan Trilateral Summit has yet to take place, there have been, as far as I understand, 5 foreign minister level meetings under the Trump administration, and along with multiple joint military exercises, often with additional partners such as Australia and the Philippines. So the Biden administration led this effort to institutionalize the trilateral cooperation with the goal of insulating, so to speak, this framework from political transitions in any of the 3 capitals. And then so far, I think that the signals that we're seeing is that that framework appears to be durable.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, what's been interesting is exactly to the question that you posed is how do new personalities carrying on this same commitments that are across so many domains. I mean, defense is a really core part of this, increasing defense and information sharing, but also the commitments, if you read the fact sheet from the Camp David Summit a couple of years ago, it spans also things like health cooperation and economic supply chain security sorts of like maintenance and coordination. And that happened under Biden. And it was a continuation of, I think, a larger vision that had started in the Obama administration of a more broader, integrated Indo-Pacific. It did take, as Ms. Nakano mentioned, it took language from Shinzo Abe's idea of this free and open Indo-Pacific. So it started with the Japanese idea. And it was also, so we had Biden, we had at the time Kishida in Japan, and we had Yoon Suk-yeol, the conservative president at the time in South Korea, who was really trying to be bullish on expanding not only South Korea's role in trilateral cooperation, but also further afield. So Yoon was also making efforts to build out South Korea's relationship with NATO in particular, a much bigger vision of what they would play on the global stage. So those are very different visions than what we see now in all 3 cases. I mean, with the exception of maybe the conservative vision in Japan is there's some lineage there, but Trump's vision for the Indo-Pacific is very different. Lee Jae-myung's vision for the Indo-Pacific and South Korea's role in the world is a bit different as well from Yoon. And so the conversation I've over the past couple of years is who's going to be leading this, right? It was Biden was leading it in the initial. He helped, shepherd the initial Camp David summit. Then when Trump was elected, I remember the idea was, okay, well, Yoon Suk-yeol, the conservative who has this very expansive vision for South Korea, he was going to be leading the way for this trilateralism. And then very shortly after Trump's election, he was impeached, and then we had a progressive front runner. I think what's surprising now is that it's really the Japan-Korea leg that's a bit surprising. And it actually seems to be sustaining the momentum going forward, which if you would have asked like a Korea watcher or a Japan watcher 5 years ago, would a Korean progressive and a Japanese strong conservative be leading the way on trilateralism, it actually would be it would be quite surprising. But we are seeing continued. A lot of it's maybe a little bit not necessarily with the fanfare of the summit that happens, but there is some momentum in some of the more like technical aspects of carrying it forward, maybe not necessarily the high level spectacle aspects of the trilateral.
Well, this has been a great discussion. Thank you so much to both Yuko and to Darcie. I apologize to those who have submitted questions in the chat because I'm respectful or want to be respectful of our panelists' time as well as your time for those people who have participated. So I know we're getting down to the close of our allotted hour, but if I could ask Yuko and Darcie to do the impossible, I'm going to briefly summarize the few questions that we have, and then you can just lightning round, just shoot back answers if you could. And I do appreciate the attendees for submitting questions. So one of the questions is regarding they see a pragmatism in the Korean approach. Is there a similar contrast with contemporary Japanese politics and culture that is, or is this a uniquely Korean phenomenon that we're seeing in terms of the politics playing out? Are the Japanese Prime Minister and the South Korean president's approaches for engaging with other states beyond China, Taiwan, Southeast Asia, Australia, and India, etc. Can you touch a little bit more broadly about that? And also, do you see a more comprehensive strategy to mitigate risks from the U.S.-China competition, or is more engagement ad hoc needed? Also, to Darcie in particular, with the recent and surprising diplomatic relations between the Japanese Prime Minister and the President, do you think that this is out of security necessity or a new transition taking a step away from historical structures and events? So apologize for throwing this all at you. Feel free to answer or hit many points as you can, and then we'll close our conversation. Darcie, Yuko, whoever wants to take the lead first. Feel free. You both are on mute right now.
Okay, I'll go ahead just for the sake of time. And I'll be really brief. Just on the diversification, Korea's really been trying to do this. I think it centers in its foreign policy, it centers the United States alliance, its relations with North Korea and China. But really over the past 15 years, we've seen a diversification across both progressive and conservative administrations. So more closely with Southeast Asian specifically, to India. That's another really important node, and to in certain sectors, both diplomatic and industrial. Europe is a really important target for Korea, especially we think about key industries like batteries. It's actually becoming and digital infrastructure. These have been actually its outreach to Europe as well. So this is really I think. The center of South Korea's policy has to be based on its defense treaty with the United States, but it really is trying to diversify. With the caveat that this president in South Korea is he's a domestic guy, so he's not necessarily doing big overtures toward Southeast Asia like his predecessors did, and that's the one that stands out in my head in particular, doing like goodwill tours across ASEAN member states, but a lot of it's in service of his domestic goals. And then that's also a very good question about this shift. I think that it's both. Maybe that's not fair, but I think the reality of the situation is the security situation in Northeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific has changed. I think partly is the questions about what the United States is going to be doing as part of its shift, its Western Hemisphere shift. Right now, we're seeing some questions about what that does mean, especially after the past weekend. But there's a lot of questions about what does that mean for the United States-South Korea alliance. And so necessarily like-minded partners or like-minded security environments or like-minded security threats that Korea and Japan share are driving the two closer together. And that includes not necessarily direct territorial security, but also economic security. So there's fears in both countries about economic coercion from China in particular. That's energy, supply chain, critical minerals, the factories that they've put in China. Like there's this big sense of insecurity on the economic side. But then I also think, and I've documented this elsewhere, is I think that there's a generation shift that's going on where you can see this in public opinion data where younger South Koreans don't see Japanese as a threat or as an adversary like some of the older South Koreans did. And for very real reason, older South Koreans, they themselves, if they're old enough, or their relatives lived through the Japanese imperial period, so they have direct memories of this. But the younger South Koreans see themselves as a peer to Japan, right? They're now like Japan cool was a thing, and then I remember in the 90s and 2000s, Japan cool was a thing. Japan was like a global, powerhouse. Now Korea is, and so I think that there's a lot of that is driving the younger sentiment that's changing in South Korea as well.
Well, so just very quickly, so one of the examples that came to my mind is Japan's deepening engagement with the Southeast Asian countries, in particular with the Philippines. And then it's not just through the traditional ODAs, but also recently the increased cooperation on defense equipment, providing this defense equipment to the Philippines. But for the sake of saving time, like if I'll be happy to have the conversation offline, so I will just end it here.
Yuko Nakano and Dr. Darcie Draudt-Véjares. Thank you, Yuko and Darcie, for sharing your insights. I found this to be very informative, fascinating, and I've enjoyed it. So I hope for those of you who have participated and joined us for today's webinar, you feel the same. We know you're very busy and appreciate the time you've taken to participate with the U.S. Asia Institute. So now I'll turn it over back to Kendall for final comments.
And that's really all. Thank you all for coming, and thank you so much to our esteemed speakers and moderator. Have a great afternoon.